The ultimate means of persuasion we have with others is for us to embody ourselves, whatever the quality is, and then deepen our bond with others. That's the only way, I think, to really respect their freedom. So the bond is free, yeah, and that they get our good example of giving is free. So when people have an experience of a bond with a giver, that's what makes them likely to become givers themselves.
Hey, this is Sharif here with another episode of the Golden Hour, joined by Dr. Kevin Majors. Kevin, good to be here with you again.
Hey, Sharif, thanks for having me back.
Yeah, of course. Well, Kevin, we promised at the end of the last episode on that we did on givers and takers, giving and taking, that we do a follow up, and so I think it's good that we do that right now. Next, let's roll. So, uh, I think where we ended up at the end of the last one was we had described the framework of givers and takers, and you made this observation following Adam Grant that uh, who has the book Givers and Takers, that givers seem to end up at both the bottom and the top of the success ladder. So we talked a little bit about what differentiates givers at the bottom from givers at the top, and how people who listen to our podcast, to the Golden Hour, can, because we're encouraging them to be generous, to be givers, right? That's how work and life are most meaningful. So giving some insight into how to become a giver at the top, how to become a giver and a giver at the top. So I thought we could kind of start by uh, diving into that a little bit more.
Yeah, good. Because I think maybe where we left was the idea that the people who are able to be prudent for themselves, and they can engage in sustainable giving. And so it sets it up as a boundary issue. So maybe it would seem then like the people who are successful givers are the ones who have really clear boundaries. And they're like, and so they don't let people cross certain lines. And so they're kind of good at enforcing these boundaries. And the unsuccessful givers then would be the people who don't have clear boundaries. I think that might not be the right thing, though, nor is it actually what Adam Grant is trying to say, but maybe he leans a little more in that direction than we would. Uh, I think that what's really underlying this is something he does refer to at one point, and it's the flexibility of your style of reciprocating. Now, people who are takers, they could kind of give at some points. There's a little bit of flexibility there, but not much. They basically are still going to be interested in their own interests and taking as much as they can, but they can fake it. So that doesn't really make them givers, but they can fake giving as long as they need to keep up the appearances. So they're actually like not that flexible. If you think about it, they're not really free to be totally generous with others because they tend to be dominated by really their own selfish interest. The matchers are people who can match tit for tat, perhaps in a more or less generous way, but they also, they're good at being fair, but they're not necessarily, again, as free to be generous. I think they're more free than the takers are. So you can see there's a little more flexibility. They do engage more in give and take. And so giving is more a part of their life than for takers, that's for sure. The successful givers are the ones who have total flexibility. As needed, they can do it, they can give generously. That can even be their first impulse. That their first thing is just to give until they realize that they're dealing with someone who's not giving back. And then they can become a matcher. And so they can switch their styles. I don't know if they become takers, but but as needed. And it might be that at times they do for the sake of their family and others, they have to like become more takers and demand a raise or demand certain things. So the most flexible people of all are what we called in the last episode the successful givers. But it's because they have the freedom to be totally generous and they have the freedom to have that as a first impulse. The people who have the least flexibility are what are called this unsuccessful givers. And the reason that they have the least is because they are under emotional compulsion to not take. So they are always afraid of imposing on other people. So they think that somehow, like maybe if they ask anything of anyone, that person will abandon them, or somehow they will be left on their own. I think there's a myriad reasons. But the fact is, they feel constrained to give. And it's not really this free flowering of flexibility. It's instead this compulsive sense of having to give because they're really terrified of taking. And they would feel terribly, perhaps, guilty if they didn't give in something. So they're under this emotional compulsion. So I think they're actually the least flexible. So that gives us a little bit of a spectrum then. That if you're just looking from who is least flexible to most flexible, it's actually the same exact spectrum that Adam Grant lays out.
Yeah. So to what extent then can we say that at the top and the bottom they're both givers? Because it seems like there's actually this huge difference in the way they approach. So I'm trying to understand how exactly giver is defined. Are the people at the bottom have this tendency um, to give, to contribute, to be generous with their time, using that for other people's benefit or using that for the company's benefit. But it seems like the people at the top have this kind of, it's not as much about me giving, but it's about what's for the common good. How do we all work together? And maybe I need help this time, and that's actually um, for me to be helped is actually for the benefit of everyone because I'm the weakest link. So there might be some kind of acknowledgement, like humility there. So how, to what extent do you think it's fair to actually characterize the givers at the top and at the bottom as kind of in the same category of they're both givers?
I think they're both givers in the sense that they take seriously the interests of other people. So that they are good at giving others priority. But the problem is that the ones, the inflexible givers don't give themselves priority either. And so they end up compulsively giving others the priority. And so compulsively giving. But there is a real giving behavior there, I think. And so it's the same then, the more successful givers are the flexible ones. They can shift. They can be matchers when they need to. They can ask for raises when they need to. They can fight for things when they need to. So they're capable of fighting, and they're capable of even being disagreeable, but they can do all of this flexibly. So it's not just one style of always being. But I think it's a great question you ask. And maybe kind of what you're asking is giving one virtue that then has these two different outcomes? And it does seem like the difference is that more successful givers really have the voluntary habit, the kind of giving that makes that's just partly it's just like it's part of prudence, it's part of everything. So it's prudent, it's just, it has fortitude, it has all these qualities in it. So it's like the fullness of it. And I think that's the real virtuous cycle at work. Because virtuous cycles, as you are getting the good behavior gets easier and more enjoyable and more meaningful. But I don't think that happens when people are inflexibly giving, when they're stuck in giving. They're not experiencing that sense of of thriving on the challenges that come. So maybe you could also say that, there's this attitude towards challenge and difficulty itself that somehow when you are giving voluntarily and flexibly, and reasonably in a sustainable way, well, then you're able to see how everyone can come to thrive on different challenges. And you're not kind of afraid of challenges per se for yourself or others.
Yeah, and the more you bring up the concept of rigidity versus flexibility, it makes me think of left brain versus right brain, and we've done a number of episodes on that. That so the givers at the bottom seem to have this approach of it's almost like they're following a rule of like give or be focused on other people. So, and when you're following a rule or being, I think you use the phrase emotionally constrained earlier, uh, it seems very rule based. Like there's just one way of doing things, and they always have to be done this way. That strikes me as a left brain approach. The takers too have this left brain, like zero sum, everything's fixed outcomes, and so that's why I have to take. And the matchers with the kind of tit for tat approach, that also strikes me as a very left brain way of seeing the world in terms of this kind of justice. But the right brain, they have this flexibility to approach different situations in different ways depending what the circumstances demand. So I'd be interested to get your thoughts on, yeah, can we see this in terms of left brain, right brain, and then if so, what conclusions can we draw from that insight?
That's a very interesting observation. Two things strike me then as when you look at what does the left brain value versus what does the right brain value. Now, obviously, these are not like halves of us doing things. So it's not like but the idea is that the left and right brains are two different lenses and they're optimized for different types of things. So this is just the way the brain is built. So the left brain, what it values most in some sense is predictability, which means efficiency. So conservation of effort, the path of least resistance, is going to be what it will rotely do. And it also is, when people are caught in these emotional compulsions, it's very clearly a left brain dynamic. They're trying to satisfy their emotions. But that whole idea of satisfying your own emotions means that you're kind of operating within your own world, within yourself. It's not really about what's best for the common good, what's best for the family, what's best for the relationship. So I think that's really true, that when you look at people who are stuck in giving as their only style, it's going to every time it comes up, it's going to feel like the path of least resistance. Like, oh, I'm not, it's gonna be so much work to try to get this person to give or to get this person to reciprocate in some way. So I just can't expect anything and so I'm just gonna go and do it myself. But that's an interesting hallmark, isn't it? Of like how the left brain is more about getting things done efficiently and predictably. And if you start to rock the boat in your company, in your family, by having actually asks that you make of other people, well, then it could be really scary and unpredictable. And the left brain doesn't like unpredictable. Or people don't when they're relying more on the left brain process. Though with the right brain, if we're going to continue speaking like that, what it prioritizes is bonds with others. Ideals, but ideals are actually really the same thing in the end as bonds. So the bonds with others are what matter most. And when you look at the different kinds of giving styles, and you ask yourself, who of these four types are really capable of forming bonds? Well, takers are not great at bonding, right? Because it requires reciprocity. Matchers aren't really good at bonds either. And again, I'm not saying someone is necessarily a matcher in every environment, but if they were, everything would be about fairness. Yeah. I don't know, like in relationships and people that I have counseled, nothing really destroys a young romance like fairness. It's, because then everything is a balancing of who's doing, like when they get married, who's doing more chores, who's doing more of this, and then is it exactly equal? And that's really, really painful for people when they get caught in that. But that's the matcher dynamic where everything in relation. So matchers aren't good at deepening bonds. They might maintain a bond reasonably well, but it's hard for them to develop them. Developing the bond comes really from successful giving, you could say, from being able to have the other person's truly at heart while not losing sight of your own well-being, so that you're an equal partner in the bond. And so you have your own desires and wishes, but you also are capable of giving yourself unstintingly to the good of the other, so that the other starts to trust you and you trust them. So there's a mutual dynamic of trust and giving, that you're not, it's not tit for tat like a matcher family or office. It's but instead this trust that the other one is totally giving, and that you will also be taken care of. That's really I think the beauty of the bond. And I think that the givers on the bottom have a hard time with that. And so they have bond trouble. They don't trust the bond. And maybe their style of giving, by never asking anything of anyone, has actually somehow eclipsed the ability of others to form bonds with them. And it would have been good if they had stood up a little more and been a kind of a real person, an equal partner in the relationship, so to speak.
Yeah. Okay. This is a great analysis. So, in the master class, in the fourth week, you talk a lot about ideals and bonds, and specifically, and then left brain, right brain, and the way to kind of shift from left to relying on your left to uh, with your using your right more, is sincerity, humility, generosity, and that the kind of hallmark of the left brain is this seeking outcomes. And so with sincerity, we start by being sincere about, hey, what am I really seeking? Am I seeking ideals and bonds, or am I seeking this outcome? So how would you apply that analysis to this situation where what is the outcome that maybe a giver it might be seeking, might be attached to, that they need to sincerely kind of acknowledge that and then detach themselves from that outcome and instead seek some ideal or bond.
Yeah. So if what we're saying holds that this idea that the givers on the bottom are more left brained and they're giving out of constraint and the path of least resistance, then I think that sincerity means that they're capable of seeking the good of others, even if it makes them feel uncomfortable. Okay. That's what happens when you ask people for things and you give them a chance to be generous themselves. One of the phrases in the book Give and Take that I like the most is opportunity stealing. It's this idea that if you're always giving to others and you're never giving them a chance to reciprocate and to give, then in a way you've stolen an opportunity for them. It would be like if you were training someone in an office, like let's say you're in marketing, and you're training someone under you and you give all the presentations because it'd be so much to ask them to do it because they're new. And well, at some point you have to not give. You have to hold back and then let them rise to the challenge.
Mhm. Or
Hmm.
maybe you even think they're not going to do a good job, and it's just like, well, I know I can do it, so I'll just do it.
Yeah. So then you don't let them go through the process of getting to the point where they can do a good job. And so there is something there that be a sincere giver, I think actually means trusting others to rise to the occasion and then giving them the support they need to rise. So I think, for instance, I don't know if someone has come to rely on your giving, okay, I don't think you want to just pull it out. So let's say, so it could be that it might be that you're going to have to set a date. If you've been doing something for someone in your life and it's been going on too long, and you feel like, so if you were the boss, it'd be like, look, come December 1st, I want you to start giving these presentations. You wouldn't just say tomorrow, you give it, I'm not going to give it. So, it's like if, I don't know, if let's say that a parent has been making the lunch for their children, and now the children are clearly old enough, they could make their own lunch. I think you can say, well, at the start of the next semester, the start of the next school year, then it's going to be your turn to make. I think when people have these kinds of dates in mind, it can be a way of establishing a limit that wasn't there before. But you have to do it without knowing you will feel guilty and you will feel like you're, and then what's the right thing to do with that? Well, it's to actually be seeking then to build up the other person's skills and to be the resource for them. There is a path for your generosity, but it's not by you doing everything. It's actually by you fading to the background, which I think is the humility part, and then supporting the others generously so that they can come to thrive.
That's great. And it gets to another question I have, which there's this idea now of kind of nudging people in the right direction. I think it's especially relevant for organizations or maybe even public policy. Is that there's this classic example of, if you want to get people to be organ donors, you make it opt out instead of opt in. So the box starts out checked, and then 95% of people become organ donors. Whereas if they have to check the box to become an organ donor, then only 5% do it, or something like that. So the idea is that, yeah, you can kind of nudge people to do the right thing by setting the conditions and circumstances that make that, the easier behavior. So it seems like people might have this approach within an organization. Hey, we want people to become givers or successful givers. So what nudges can we put in place to make that uh, more attractive for people or easier for people? How would you compare that approach with what you've outlined here, where it seems like a much more, it's not, you're not advocating like a policy driven approach. It's more of a one-on-one, it's more of a teacher, it's, or a mentor, or a coach, or there's a real relationship there, and there's a bond as the one person is teaching the other person how to become a giver. So I wonder if you could comment on the efficacy of those
Mm.
two
That's
approaches.
a it, that's an interesting question. It reminds me of what happened at Harvard under Dean Dingman. So where the Harvard saw that there's this problem where individually the students valued being kind and compassionate, but they felt that the others didn't. And so they felt that like somehow the atmosphere here just doesn't lend, like, so I have to be more tough or I have to be more competitive. So he came up with this pledge that they would make, and where they basically make a pledge to put kindness on par with intellectual attainment. And they sign the pledge, and then it would be posted in their entryways of the different dorms. So you see that everyone here who lives here has, you see that they've signed it. I think in the end there was a bit of an uproar over it, and so it was all undone. And other psychologists studied the initiative to see if they, is this a good way of nudging people? So what they found is that, just to kind of skip to the point, if people publicly get to identify themselves as givers, it doesn't make them givers. They kind of feel like they've done their giving and they've gotten their giving credentials in a way. So in the end, it doesn't really help people to actually be givers. It has to come from within. Giving needs to be a free choice. So you have to freely give for it really to be generosity. And I think that's the key, is that the ideal of generosity is this free and mature capability to give yourself, as the situation allows, as the bond allows. Because the way you give yourself to, a spouse is different than the way you give yourself to a coworker and so on. So the different kinds of bonds really entail a different kind of generosity. And it wouldn't be right to be as generous with your, you know, coworkers as with your kids. So, or something like that. Um, so I think the giving has to be done freely. The free giving then is what allows a virtuous cycle to develop, where now it's internally reinforcing, because that kind of action really is its own reward. And it's a beautiful thing you see that when people get into, in some ways, generosity is the most mature attainment psychologically that we're capable of. I think it's like, it's something that we all have to move towards having. No one starts with real generosity. So we might give out of fear, or we might not give at all, or we might give out of fairness only. Eventually, the more we get these opportunities to freely give to others, we start to see that there's a joy that comes in giving. And you start to see that, the saying that the measure that you give is the measure that you will get. That's true, even at the immediate level, that when we are fully capable of giving ourselves, we receive the best from others. We tend to bring out the best in others. and we're capable of appreciating the goodness around us.
Hmm. Well, Kevin, I think, yeah, there's a real beauty to that, to that approach, to that way of seeing things. So, um, I just have one last question now, because we're basically out of time. I feel like we're circling around this, and um, the so and I'm going to put the question in the wrong way to start, which is, how do you get someone to become a giver? I think people might have that question. I want to help people become a giver. I just, why can't they just become a giver? I want them to be a giver. And part of what you're saying is, well, you can't just get people to become a giver, because the whole point of being a giver is that it's kind of free, and this generosity that comes from within. So the you can't get people to do that. They freely, they do it of their own accord. Um, but there it does have to be a sense, right, where you can at least show the, kind of model it for them, or give an example of a giver, like a successful giver, where the, you're a giver, you're generous, you're happy, and that makes it more attractive for the people around you to also be givers. Or in conversation, you're kind of encouraging them, like understanding, encouraging, practical, like we talk about in the coaching class. So I don't know if you have any sort of sense of that, the conversations or the example, how that fits to in kind of helping people around you become givers, even though you can't get them to become a giver, you can't make them.
Yeah, the ultimate means of persuasion we have with others is for us to embody ourselves, whatever the quality is, and then deepen our bond with others. That's the only way, I think, to really respect their freedom. So the bond is free, yeah, and that they get our good example of giving is free. So when people have an experience of a bond with a giver, that's what makes them likely to become givers themselves. If all the people in your life are takers or matchers, well, then it'd be really hard to be a giver in that situation. But if you can do it, if you can learn to start giving wisely, to get to, so that people know that when you're giving, it's not out of compulsion. It's not because you're afraid of, it's that in fact you're totally capable of saying no, and you're freely deciding to say yes. They can then recognize the generosity in your motive and reciprocate it with actual generosity of their own. So I say, become a deeper, more free, flexible giver yourself, and then you will be developing bonds with others, and those bonds will be what brings out the best in them.
Okay, wonderful, Kevin. I think that is a great note to end on.
Thank
Thanks
you,
so
Sharif.
much.
So thanks for the conversation. Great
Yeah.
questions, as always.
All right, we'll be back next week.